My name's Alister Thorpe. I'm a lecturer at the University of Melbourne, and I'm also doing my PhD around ethics. So I'm very interested in the discussions we've been having in the last 2 days around data sovereignty. And I think the presentations that we've seen have been, I think it's exciting for me. I feel really excited about some of the solutions that we're coming up with in our communities. So I think with this session we'll talk about the future of data sovereignty and what are some of the steps we need to take to progress this. So I'll just get everyone to introduce themselves. Maybe we start up the top. Chris?
Yeah, sorry, I'm back again. Chris Halacas from the Victorian Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation. I am the acting manager of the Health Evidence Team.
I'm Vanessa Teague from the Computing and Information Systems Department at the University of Melbourne, and my topic is the technical details about privacy and cybersecurity for data.
Oh, that's so sexy. I want to hear more about that. Tahu Kukutai, University of Waikato.
Mokak, I'm Jugan Yarra man. My family from Broome originally, and the Lowitja Institute CEO.
And I'm Debbie Goodwin. I'm from the Bureau of Statistics. I'm the director of the Centre of Excellence for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Statistics.
Could you introduce me? That would be great.
I can actually. I know who you are.
There you go, that would be fine. Fiona Stanley, formerly from the Telethon Institute and also now from the University of Melbourne, which is very nice. Thank you.
So maybe I'll start with if someone can talk about what they think are some of the key actions that we need to think about in taking data sovereignty agenda forward. Maybe Ron, do you want to start off?
Thanks, Al. I just want to acknowledge that Al's a recipient of a Lowitja Institute award, and just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of people in the room, including Fiona, one of our board members here, and I'm happy to talk a bit more about the Lowitja Institute and the network that we have already. But I was really impressed with your presentation, Tahu, and this notion of the continuum. And so where do we really focus our energies to bring about change along that continuum? And I don't think it has to be at all dichotomous or binary or kind of contested, because as Indigenous people, we know that we have to do multiple things simultaneously. So we have to tackle the big agenda going forward as well as deal with the stuff that we have to deal with, in the present. So I like the idea of, how we can gain greater control over existing collections, existing data sets. And I don't think we should be disempowered by, and I'm not surprised, I've been on ministerial committees, it doesn't surprise me that governments at a whim will get rid of, good stuff. So while there might have been anger or disappointment displayed, this is a part of a regular and predictable narrative in governmental relations with Indigenous people. So it doesn't surprise me at all. So what I'm interested in is how do we grow our own institutions, our own governance approaches? What are the tools that sit beneath that might be nascent now, but grow in strength from year to year, and how that strength is a collective one, not an individual, not as advisors, but as institutions with a collectivity that connects us with Brewarrina to British Columbia to Waikato, as well as at the various levels that Ian Anderson was talking about, regional, state, national.
I'm happy to address this. I think this has been the most fantastic meeting, and I think what I'd like to think that we now do is to take the learnings that we've got from particularly the, I'm going to call them small groups, but the local community groups who are actually practicing Indigenous data sovereignty beautifully, and they're practicing not only in their control of their data and collecting what they want, but by jingoes converting it into really phenomenal outcomes, improved outcomes for their community. So they've been wonderful examples, and I think we need to support them more. I don't know what the collective we is here, but surely we can make the case for. Perhaps even this symposium, Marcia could put out some kind of statement about the need for these to be supported, because they're trying desperately to get funding, but to share those learnings, and to share those learnings so that other communities can benefit from these incredible examples of what is Indigenous data sovereignty in action at a local community. But then there's the other big issue, which of course we touched upon with AIATSIS, and you'll be touching on, and it'd be great to hear your perspectives on this, Debbie, in terms of the large national data sets or the large state-based data sets, not just health, but education, child protection, justice, corrective services, police, and so on, where there's a huge amount of a national title, a native title, all the things that we've been hearing about, huge amount of data with Aboriginal identification, and yet you don't have your Council of Chiefs, we don't have how do we indigenise those data sets to enable some kind of process of Indigenous data sovereignty to occur? And I think that's a huge challenge, but I do think we need to bring back AIATSIS, bring back a Council of Chiefs, stop closing down all the Aboriginal advisory groups without notice. All of those things are just totally unacceptable. But it's making it very, very hard, I think, for Aboriginal people then to have their say. And I just think that from today, where are we going to go? I've been so excited and impressed by what's happening. And so there's messages for ABS, there's messages for OHW, but there's messages for us as universities. And we were talking about this earlier, Marcia, about what are universities going to do now? The powerful, well-funded universities who've got significant power to help. We should be putting out perhaps some guidelines of what we should be doing for Indigenous data sovereignty and putting out those principles so that they will make a difference. And I think these are things. I just wanted to make one last comment about the previous session. One thing where, again, I feel we as a group of researchers let down the Aboriginal controlled sector. And 20 years ago, we should have been getting data to show the power of Aboriginal control and why Aboriginal control was so important for the health and well-being of Aboriginal people. And we failed the Aboriginal medical services by not doing that research, and it meant that they've often been under threat because of that. And I think we still got a lot of work to do to demonstrate why Aboriginal control is such an important aspect of all services and the outcome, but not only for the services and their delivery, because people go all the way across Brisbane to go to an Aboriginal medical service, isn't that right? But also how that affects Aboriginal people's self-esteem, like the Michael Chandler data from British Columbia, which shows that that's very protective of things like suicide and improved mental health. Anyway, thank you. That's my little bob's worth.
Over to me.
Yeah,
well, I guess from the
Segues
perspective,
into you.
from the perspective of the Bureau of Statistics, and I believe I wasn't here to hear it, but Fadwal spoke about it yesterday. We're bound by, as government organisations, we've got legislative restrictions in terms of the way that we provide information back to community. But there's probably 3 initiatives that I'd like to talk to you about around the data sovereignty agenda. So one of them is we have a program where we have established partnerships with Aboriginal organisations, particularly in the health space with the First Peoples Disability Network, and produced, we've combined qualitative research from the Disability Network with quantitative information from our social survey, and produced some really rich analysis that tells a very good, very complete picture, I guess, about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander experience with disability. And we're looking for other opportunities to forge those sorts of partnerships. The other thing that we do, we have a very strong program of taking information back to community. So whilst we can't return it back at the individual level, we are very committed to taking information back to community once we've completed a survey, for example, or the census is the big one at the moment, to empower people, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, to use the information that we've collected from them. So teach them how to actually use the information and what the story tells. And the third one has escaped me. I'm trying to think. Was it? I had 3 points. I should have brought my notebook.
It's all right.
What was that?
It'll come back to you.
No, I wasn't going to talk about the census question specifically, but I can.
Yes.
Is that about the actual Indigenous identifier?
No, it's how Aboriginal people have influence in what questions are asked.
On the census? So, well, with all of our surveys, with all of our survey program, including the census, we do a lot of stakeholder consultation. We have a roundtable that is comprised of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members at the grassroots level, and they, when we're developing surveys or and we're about to embark on 2021 census topic consultation, they'll be involved in providing input. It won't be just through them that we engage with the community, but there are lots of avenues where members of the community can have input into our work program and the way that we ask questions. We set up specific reference groups for different topics that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and we try very hard to make sure that we do have representation from the community on those groups.
Chris,
Anyone?
thanks.
Yeah.
So that's a perspective from the ABS. How do we engage ACHOs into this discussion or to be part of this? I know we've seen a lot of community groups that they're taking on that responsibility themselves, but how do we support or engage in that conversation?
Yeah, I think ACHOs are already engaged very much in data analysis. I mean, a few years ago when VATCHO first from our members meeting decided to go and pursue a data strategy, it was to collect data and do something with it for ACHOs and to get more comprehensive understanding of what's going on. Since then, we have information exchange agreements with all our health services in the state, so 23 that submit comprehensive primary care data every month to VATCHO. As far as governing that arrangement as well, we have our members meetings about 3 times each year. We have CEO groups meets a few times each year. We have 28 people on our data advisory group that meet by webinar every 6 weeks. They choose the topic that we focus on our 3-month webinar cycles for quality improvement. So at the moment we're doing stuff around chronic disease management. We've done asthma management earlier in the year, and we did diabetes management last year, and we started in alcohol and demographic recording in this is within the health practices. I think we sort of tapped into a secret society of data nerds within the ACHOs that have just been sort of waiting for these networks to exist and to engage. So I think it's really about that relationships and creating and facilitating the space for that stuff to happen so people can share what great work is going on and what passionate work is going on within services, but also to share and also to get ideas from others. So I think from... on top, I guess the other thing on top of that, I just want to add is that there's a huge appetite for data. We've sent out, I think, 300 individualised dashboard reports for members, which a bit of friendly competition, compare each other over the little 3 months, and we award little prizes at the end of it, and everyone really gets into it. It's really fun. But I think our challenge is expanding beyond just primary care data. I was talking with Daphne and David from Ramiak here just over at the break before, and we were talking about how you need that sort of like the wider data sets. You need to bring in justice figures, and they need to be quite detailed around what it is. I think Daphne was using the example of statistics, like say like crime statistics, and is it a small number of people offending lots of times, or is it a large number of people? Like that, there's sort of data challenges that we need to face. But I think the only way we can do that is to actually engage with ACCHOs in this space and be there to build capacity within the services and to stop the short-term funding and the changes to the funding. I mean, we have had 3 different 12-month cycles where deliverables have changed. I've had 6 roles at ACCHO in the past 5 years. And that's just because that particular funding stream ran out. So you have to be so flexible, and you can't have the stability to get these long-term outcomes when things change so much all the time.
You need a PhD in how to get funding, actually.
Vanessa, I might ask you about what some of the ethical considerations or risks, challenges that we might have going forward in this area.
So I'm a card-carrying member of the Secret Society of Data Geeks. I'm really a mathematician at heart, and I don't have the answers to any of these questions, but I have some kind of detailed things to say about what's really true about a data set or an algorithm and what's not. So the reason that the back history about my research is that the Australian government, in its wisdom, decided that it was going to publish online the de-identified longitudinal medical billing records of 10% of the population. And I think they did this with the best of intentions. They really thought that it would be good for research and it would lead to innovation and all that kind of stuff. And they really truly thought that it was de-identified. But they were wrong. And we were able to show that it's relatively easy to re-identify at least the suppliers, which is hardly surprising given what kind of data it was, and given the history in the geek literature about just how easy it can be to re-identify complex records about people if you know a little bit of extra information about the person. So the first thing that I would input into this conversation is that you shouldn't necessarily believe the assurances that you're given about the privacy or security of a data set or a setup. That you should think about whether or not the person even knows what they're talking about, whether they've really taken the assurance to heart. And what I would love to see is more kids learning enough, or more young adults learning enough of the maths to actually be able to learn how to assess those kinds of things themselves. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing, a theme that emerged a little bit in the last panel that I would really like to pick up, is this idea that just because something is quantified, because it's a statistic or a something, that doesn't necessarily mean that that something is actually a fair or accurate portrayal of the thing. This has a name. It's called algorithmic bias. And if you look up algorithmic bias, you will see there's a huge conversation about this, especially in the United States. And again, roughly the story is that particularly as more and more decisions are made on the basis of algorithms and large amounts of input data, for example, funding decisions about schools in America, decisions about loans, and so on, they are increasingly accused of falling afoul of existing laws against racial discrimination in particular, but also gender discrimination, all kinds of other things. And the supposed defence is, oh, but I wasn't being discriminatory. I was just, I just ran this algorithm. It didn't know anything about race. It just input all the data about all of the details about the people who had paid back their loans and the people who hadn't. And, it's not my fault if it noticed that people in this particular category tend not to pay back their loans. I was being fair. It's not my fault that the data show that these kind of people don't deserve a loan. So this has been an incredibly controversial conversation in the United States. I think in the beginning people just did it because I think they thought they could get away with it, but increasingly there's a recognition that that's nonsense. I mean, obviously it's nonsense, right? But they got away with it for as long as they could. And again, I think it's a question of whether the people who are... It's a question of whether you can understand enough about the algorithm or take enough control of the data that goes into it to make sure that you can, at the very least, criticise the questions that are being asked, or better yet, think about what questions ought to be asked and what programs ought to be written and be able to influence the way that it goes.
Can I just interrupt Vanessa for a minute? Vanessa, so in relation to the last session, that was in relation to these KPIs that in
Yes.
fact would result in, if they were going to be interpreted as the Cabinet wanted, they would actually, without ever looking at, you know, the social risk factors, the morbidity factors that went into the AMSs, they were just going to fund them on the fact that they weren't performing at other levels. That's what you're referring to with this one, isn't
Yes,
it?
exactly. Yes. And to me, that's just a dud algorithm.
Yes,
that's just a dumb algorithm.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think if you can, the counter argument to that is to say, well, look, that's a dud algorithm.
Yeah.
Here's the algorithm that you should be using.
Yeah.
Here's something that would actually give a better
it's like looking at
emotional
NAPLAN data
Yes.
just alone without looking at the AEDC data, the Australian Early Development data. When if you have kids who are highly vulnerable going into school, you're likely to have poor NAPLAN results, but in fact they might be much, much better than expected if you looked at it in relation to the controlling for the AEDC, and they don't get it. And it just makes me Australian Early Development Census. So it's about kids being vulnerable going into school, and if you actually controlled the NAPLAN results for that, you'd find out that some, you know, schools in highly, you know, very poor areas are actually doing really well, because in fact they're doing really well with this group of kids who are very vulnerable, but they never control for that. And I think it's a really important point of how you interpret data, particularly in relation to marginalised populations.
Tahu,
Sorry to interrupt.
You might have some...
Well, I was enthusiastically nodding while you were saying all of that, because what you're talking about is really germane in the context of New Zealand because of the rapidity with which our government has embarked on a national level program of data linkage and data sharing. So on the one hand, we've got the integrated data infrastructure, which is de-identified. To my knowledge, it hasn't been cracked by data nerds, but it's early days yet. And interestingly, there is now a push to open up the integrated data infrastructure to overseas-based researchers. And Te Marara Aronga as a Māori data advocacy network, data sovereignty network, has that's kind of like raised the red flags about then Indigenous data being accessible overseas in the absence of any Māori data governance framework. So you might have the 5 safe security around data security, which you would probably question anyway, but then all the other issues around cultural safety and around our data use. So there's that, but then in addition to the research, and that's really meant to be for research purposes only, there's also another integrated data set where the data aren't de-identified, which is held by the Social Investment Unit. It's called the Data Exchange, and that is used as part of the social investment approach to actually identify individuals for intervention. And interestingly, some of the early work that's been done on these data sets from within Treasury is modelling the lifetime cost of the children of incarcerated parents and looking at what the overall cost to the taxpayer is of these children, and then articulating how much money can be saved if those children were intervened. No one uses the language of intervened upon, but this is basically
What about
underpinning.
trying not incarcerating their mothers? That might be
exactly.
better way to
But these aren't the
look at it.
questions that frame the predictive modelling. So it's kind of like rubbish in, rubbish out.
Yes.
And so when I'm thinking about Indigenous, what does the future of Indigenous data sovereignty look like? There's a real risk, I think, that you get technological innovation, but all we're doing really is making a more sophisticated colonial system of surveillance.
So how do we address, what are some of the things that you're doing now to address that problem?
Well, I think ultimately the vision is in us controlling our own data. There probably has to be a transition period where we have allies and where there's data intermediaries and where you kind of what might just be tweaking processes in an ad hoc sort of way. I mean, this is what's kind of going on a lot at the moment, sort of window dressing. So kind of appropriating the language of data sovereignty, but really just kind of tweaking around processes that already exist, not actually fundamentally transforming them in a way that they need to be transformed. So I think there'll be a period of these sort of adjustments and appropriation, but ultimately the vision that we want for our communities, for our people, for our data is a system where we are we create the algorithms if we want to, where we create the governance structures and the principles that are relevant, and we collect the data and analyse it, and we do that ourselves.
I mean, the word
and we don't depend on others to do that for us.
The word custodian is not a bad word in terms of this whole issue around data. And I think, you know, it may be that you do want to do international comparisons and work with other Aboriginal groups internationally in other jurisdictions. But if you are going to share your data internationally, there's positives about doing that if you are in control of it.
Yeah,
and only if you understand, you can only share data and analyse and compare data if you understand how it's been collected, what the difficulties are, what the problems with those data are. Otherwise, you can't really do that. So I think it's quite exciting, the concept of sharing data, but it has to be done under the ways you're talking. But, you know, this custodianship, you know, the word custodian, I reckon, is quite a good word in terms of not just Māori, but what we're thinking of. And really we want Aboriginal people to be custodians of their lives, and because their lives are bound up in these data sets. Anyway, just a thought.
And it's quite easy to get overwhelmed because the data ecosystem is so enormous. Like, you know, like you're reflecting on in your opening comments, like where do you strategically focus your efforts and where do you get the great, and it might not be the greatest, most impactful results, but it's, you know, it's a combination of low-hanging fruit and then having a vision, a collective vision, and then working together to try and achieve that. And sometimes that happens at the level of advocacy. I'm just a data nerd essentially, and we've just come together with other data nerds and created an advocacy group. We have no political mandate. That belongs with our tribes, and that belongs with our communities. And so, you know, our work is to do research and to support the efforts of communities, to support the efforts of our iwi chairs, our Tribal Leaders Forum. They have the political conversations. With them lies the mandate to act as sovereign nations, and all we're doing is enabling that through our research and through our advocacy. And so having real clarity about who the we is and what our role is.
Yep. And that's probably what our communities need to start talking about, and then come back to the other stakeholders, I suppose. I might open it up to questions. We've got 10 minutes left.
Janet McCallum, I've been thinking through the last 2 days about whether we actually need to think about the law, and that we don't have a Bill of Rights in Australia, and the Privacy Acts are both Commonwealth and state, and they're very inadequate now to the demands of the new technology. Do we need a law which enshrines that every bit of data about you is owned by you? It can be used for research if that research is in the public good. It cannot be sold or used for commercial gain, and it cannot be used to defame you. And this is using the laws of defamation, that it can't be used to damage your life or your relationships or your reputation. And if we did that as a universal law in Australia, that is to include non-Aboriginal people as well, we'd get past the right-wing gatekeepers. Andrew Bolt would love it, and it'd be a way in which we could enshrine some protection if there were pretty substantial penalties for both researchers and users and companies. I mean, the thing which really frightens me is the insurance companies getting into health data Vanessa just told me earlier all the New Zealand data could be hacked. Just wait for the insurance companies to get into your health data.
Janet, what about the people who are dead and can't give permission? Because, of course, that's a really important part of the data sets that we have.
Under the law at the moment, you can't defame the dead.
Oh, right.
Okay, but you could certainly have a change of the law, it wouldn't use the defamation law. No. I think you could take it back. You might want to, for instance, someone whose family history might have intergenerational criminal offending, that not be used to stigmatise that family.
Quite complex, isn't it?
Yes, it is very complex, but I think in some sense, if the information is owned by you, and that's enshrined, so every individual owns the data that governments or health institutions create, or schools create about that individual, and then, but it can be used for the public good, but that public good has to be proven through ethics committees, research surveillance, and obviously, in Aboriginal case, community control.
I think that issue it has been or is being explored through the Data Availability Issues and Use Inquiry, the Productivity Commission inquiries. Catherine, I can't see where she is.
Yes, the Productivity Commission recommendation was that the punishment be placed on the employers of researchers.
Yep.
So the onus was going to rest with the universities, for instance, and they could sack staff.
Okay.
Right, so they've got a sanction. But I think we actually need something more powerful that extends beyond. It's just not universities in this space.
Yep.
I'm much more worried about the commercial interests.
Yep.
Thanks. I wanted to come back to something we've talked about over the last couple of days, and it's about the census and the fact that people have been talking about the need for the census to provide more than just information about whether people are Aborigines or Torres Strait Islanders. And I understand that ABS is looking at this, and I guess we'd like some comments about that. And also the other issue that's been raised is about the need for Indigenous geography from the census, so we can get information about our own communities at the level that Indigenous people can specify. So I wonder if you have any comments on that. Before I finish, I'd just like to say I'd like to give a thank you to the University of Sydney, who's marked this forum on Indigenous data sovereignty by abolishing their Indigenous established Centre for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander statistics.
So for the census, so there are some initial conversations that we've been having with stakeholders around, obviously, the 2021 census, and the opportunity to perhaps include some additional information other than so we've got the standard Indigenous question, are you of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander origin? To then have a supplementary question that explores either something about country, so where are you from, where's your country, or language group. But they're very initial discussions at the moment, and there's a timetable for our topic consultation, and we don't yet have permission from we actually have to put in a submission to the government to be able to change the questions on the census. So we're not even in a position to say, yes, we're going to be able to change content at this point. But that, if we are able to change content, then we will be embarking upon, stakeholder consultation around that topic. The second question was about Indigenous geography on the census, and we do output at a range of Indigenous geographic levels, so they don't always line up to discrete Indigenous communities of very low levels, but they're at the lowest level that we possibly can provide that information without breaching our confidentiality restrictions. But it is the lowest level of information that we are able to output, and the most complete, the census data. But if you do have specific geographies that you're tackling with that we don't have available on the website, there may be things that we can do that we can tailor things for you. So we do have an information referral service number, or you can get in touch with me, and there are things that we might be able to do with the data and provide it to you.
relaying what other people have said, but
Sure.
for instance, people want to know the census data about the Yorta Nation. You know, now that's a fundamental unit for as far as Aboriginal people are concerned.
Yep.
The census doesn't talk about that.
Correct, it doesn't. I'll acknowledge that.
Hello, my name's Azura Hamis. I'm from the National Centre for Indigenous Genomics, based out of ANU in Canberra. Over the last couple of days, we've spoken a lot about Australia and data in Australia, and I'm just wondering if anyone's thought about the issue of data that's already overseas, particularly DNA, and how we tackle that problem.
Where's Misty? We need Misty Jenkins, and she's not here because she's not well. But she's been at several international meetings which has discussed this kind of issue. And I'm sorry, I don't actually have a comment about that. But I know that it's a really important issue. It's another repatriation issue, isn't it? An ownership issue, particularly DNA that was collected without consent many years ago. And I know that's both in Australia but also in overseas jurisdictions.
DNA data online now.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of it's been used to really put back the numbers by thousands of years of people living in Australia, Aboriginal people living in Australia. So it's been put to, again, good use, but it's just a very big issue. But Misty Jenkins is certainly our expert on that, and I can't refer to her.
So genetic data is not my area of expertise by any means, but in Te Mā Te Mana Raunga we have Māori who are involved in an international Indigenous networks around the ethics of biobanking, of the repatriation of Indigenous data, of developing Indigenous ethical frameworks and governance mechanisms to deal with some of the issues. I'm not sure if this is about international repatriation because you introduce a whole other set of legal issues around control and stuff when you're talking about DNA data that's stored offshore, obviously. But there is quite a vibrant international network who are grappling with those very issues, who would probably welcome. You may already be part of it, but you're not alone in trying to grapple with those by any means. And because it's DNA, when in my talk earlier on, we were talking about the level of sensitivity. You know, in Te Reo Māori, he ha te mea nui ko te tangata. The DNA is the embodiment, really, in a lot of ways of who we are. So it's very important, highly sensitive data. And it encodes in that information not just about an individual, but about families and community groups. So, if we're talking about where you focus some of that strategic vision on what data is important, I think that's really highly important. So the question, even if we've got no answers around the table, the question is a really important challenge.
Yep. Yeah, something we probably need to think about for our future protocols. We've got one more question I think we can have.
I was just going to make a brief comment about the census proposal.
Sure.
And just to, make an offer of, certainly continuing that discussion, but just to be clear about, so in the census we do actually collect information about Indigenous languages, so it would be really useful not to conflate those two. If we're going to talk about an identifier around traditional ownership, or political, that idea of an Indigenous polity, it's really careful not to conflate language group in that. Sometimes they are the same thing, but just wanting to put that out there. So because there are ways in which we can layer language information. As people know, there's the AUSTLANG database, which is the AIATSIS language database, which has all of that sort of underlying data, which has also been used for kinship and things like that. So there's certainly data that we can overlay, and also just acknowledging that there's a growing set of geospatial data in the native title context, which is held by the National Native Title Tribunal, and they certainly are looking at ways of making that data available. So as you can imagine, there's challenges with that. Saw Yorta today, for example, where there are eras of native title where claims have been put in only on what's claimable, so not including their whole territory. So there are some problems with that data set, but it's certainly quite a useful starting point for the discussion, but just to recognise that traditional ownership and language are two really useful and important sets of data, but can be the same, but can be quite different.
Thank you.
So I want to thank everyone on the panel for... Yep.
The lady from ANU reminded me when she raised the DNA stuff. There was a professor at the University of South Australia, and he was going around to the Cape York communities with photographs that Tyndale took. Tyndale did not only take photographs and stories, he also took genetic samples. And we know that hair samples and God knows what else, so there needs to be some look at the data and the protections around that, and who gave him permission to do that. Yeah. So I would like that recorded and documented in this.
Thank you. Can we all thank our panel?